During that same year, he started the Poor People's Campaign. Many people said the only time they'd ever seen Martin Luther King cry or shed any tear was in Marks, Mississippi, one of the poorest places in the country at that time. And it was kind of a symbol of the worst issues of poverty all over the country. And Martin Luther King, being pushed by others to let's do something about this, then started this huge idea that we're going to force the federal government to make plans and to put these plans into operation to reduce the amount of poverty we have in this country. The big plan was to start a wagon train in Marks, Mississippi, and to have that wagon come all the way through the states, up through weeks, it would take weeks to do this, to Washington, D.C., and that people would gather in Washington, D.C., and Martin Luther King said, we will gather there, and we will do what we have a right to do there, is beseech our government to do something about poverty. And that was poverty for everyone, not just African Americans, but of course African Americans would be included. And what's interesting is that the poverty rate for children in 1968, at the time King was killed, was between 15 and 16%. In 2016, it was 20%. So it's much larger now, and we just don't have much outcry about it. So that was the nature of the things going on then. But a key aspect of the Poor People's Campaign is Martin Luther King was devoting most of his time to that effort. And there were a lot of side efforts that he was involved in. And one of them was the Memphis garbage workers strike. That was not his main activity. That was a side activity and the kind of thing that he usually did. He would usually be called in by people who already have some kind of activity or demonstrations or strikes or protests going on about some racial issues, and call him in to provide support, knowing that he would raise the ante and that therefore things would become better known and they could have some better hope of having some success. So he says, we're going to Washington and we're going to occupy Washington. And he was talking about tens of thousands of people. We're going to occupy Washington and we're going to stay there until the government hears our pleas, until they decide to do something about poverty in the country. In fact, he would say, we're going to stop commerce if necessary. We will stop planes and buses and trains. And we're just going to stay there and force the government to deal with this issue because we're the richest country in the history of the world and we have all of these poor people who are so destitute. We should not have that. And so when he said that in 1967, late 1967, a lot of things began to change. There were a number of younger black radical groups who had left King because they did not like the kind of idea of begging for integration. But of course, Martin Luther King was for more than that, than begging for integration, but that was the main thing he was known for beforehand. And so they had left him. But when he made that kind of announcement that he was going to do that kind of thing, all these groups just jumped on and joined the bandwagon and said, we will join you, we will help you do this. This was going to be something so big that I kept saying, this is just truly, truly amazing what's going to happen. And of course, we know some of the other things. We learned those later, how Hoover was trying to get King to call it off, and he was trying to blackmail King into calling it off and doing all these kinds of things to keep that from happening. But he was killed. Many of us carried on the campaign that summer anyway, but it was much smaller. There were hundreds of people who went, there were thousands who came, but hundreds camped out on the mall area leading up to the Lincoln Monument. Many people camped out there, and they were there for weeks until they were forced off, and made many protests, but it was so much smaller than it would have been that it didn't really have much effect.